in part one, we looked at what constitutes healthy relationships, how we often end up in enmeshed relationships that are unhealthy, or indeed, if we're very unlucky, in quite trapped, isolated, abusive relationships. And we're going to look at now in part two how we learn to behave in an emotional way differently depending on whether we are born female or male. Now, how we respond emotionally, we generally learn before the age of 2, and we've usually got it fairly well perfected by the time we're 2 years of age. We are acting as boys or girls, depending on the type of messages we've had. Now, there are 4 basic human emotions: happy, sad, frightened, and angry. They are the 4 basic or core emotions. All the other emotions, jealousy, rage, depression, anxiety, and any of the many myriads that you could describe, are combinations of these or different intensities of these emotions. And when we're, from a very early age, given specific, either overt or covert messages about how to behave emotionally, we then begin to grow up acting quite differently in expressing these emotions. Now, girls and boys, as I said, get very different messages about how to behave emotionally. Girls are given permission to act frightened or sad. It is okay, acceptable, ladylike behaviour for girls to act frightened or sad. It is not okay, generally speaking, for girls to act angry. Anger is considered unladylike, undesirable, and girls get fairly clear messages: don't do that, that's unladylike, don't you behave like that around me, young lady. Those sort of things, those sorts of messages, which means that girls from a very young age learn that if they feel angry, they must substitute an acceptable emotion. And they will act frightened or sad, which in the grown woman appears as depression. The more anger there has been repressed over the years, year after year after year, never being able to express that anger, the more anger there is to be expressed, the more depression there will be acted. So in the grown woman, scratch the surface of this depression and you will find huge amounts of anger unexpressed over the years. The opposite is true for boys. Boys get the message that it is okay to express anger. That's manly, acceptable behaviour. It is not okay for boys and men to express fear or sadness. They learn that it is being pathetic, a bit wussy, sissy, to express fear or sadness, generally speaking. So as a general principle, boys by the time they're 2 have learnt, if they feel frightened or sad, to act angry. So by the time they're adult males, by the time they're men, if you scratch the surface of that anger, you'll find just underneath it, generally speaking, lots of fear and sadness that's been unexpressed over the years, year after year after year after year. Now the problem is that if you are feeling frightened or sad, you need to be looked after, you need to be nurtured. You need somebody to come up and give you a hug. It's very sad that your puppy's died, or it's okay to be frightened that there might be a boogeyman in the cupboard. It's okay, we'll be here. We'll put the light on, we'll look after it, we'll stay here until you go to sleep. We do not go up to somebody who is acting angry and nurture them. We don't go up to, particularly, an angry male, adult, who's really angry, acting angry, and say, do you want a hug? Because this would be extremely threatening for all of us. Most of us will in fact do one of two things. Either fight back, because we're angry about it, don't you get angry with me, and they fight back, which leaves this person feeling more frightened when somebody else attacks them. Or we get frightened of their anger and withdraw. We disappear, which leaves them feeling more sad and abandoned. So if this adult male who's been perfecting this technique since he was 2, if he feels frightened or sad to act angry, if when he acts angry we respond to that by fighting or fleeing, the fight or flight mechanism, he will end up feeling even more frightened or sad. All he can do is express it as greater anger. He acts more angry. We respond to the greater anger by fighting back or fleeing quicker, which leaves him feeling even more frightened and sad. All he can do is act even more angry. We respond to the greater anger, which makes him feel more frightened and sad. He acts more angry. So that escalates in this sort of spiral, getting bigger and bigger over the years into increased levels of violence and aggression acted out by men. It escalates by itself over the years. Many of the violent men that I've worked with have said to me, I'm getting worse, it's getting out of control, I don't know why, I don't even know where it comes from, but I'm acting more dangerously all the time as I get older, it's getting worse. If you speak to any woman who's been in a violent relationship, she'll say it gets worse as the years go forward. So this escalates by itself into increasing levels of violence and aggression. But if you put them together in a relationship, this becomes similar to a thermonuclear device waiting to go bang. You can start anywhere here and it will keep perpetuating itself. But let's start here. Let's say this particular man gets the message at work, this report is rubbish. You raise your game or you've lost your job. So he's actually frightened that he's going to lose his job, or sad that he's been devalued, and possibly both. Nobody recognises how much work I've put into this, nobody recognises how good it's been, so he's actually frightened or sad. It's touched the old wounds that have been going on and on and on over the years unexpressed. He zips straight into anger, doesn't even feel the frightened or sad, zips straight into anger. He is acting angry. So he's driving home, really pumped up, doesn't know why he's angry, comes in through the front door, slams the door shut and says, "What's this shit on the floor? Why don't you keep the house clean?" Which in fact triggers off her anger. Her response to that is, "How dare you come in here and treat me like this? I've been doing this, this, this and this all day. I don't deserve this. This is not fair." But she can't express anger. She's not allowed to be angry. So what she does is translate this immediately into fear or sadness, and she looks very depressed, very hurt. So she's acting very depressed, which of course pokes some salt in the old wounds here. Just gives him a flick of the fear and sadness that he's not allowed to feel, can't stay with that. So he now is feeling even more frightened and sad, zips into even more anger and says, "Oh God, I'm sick of you, always whinging, you're always complaining, you're always depressed, I'm sick of it," which makes her even more angry. She's enraged now, she bursts into tears. When she bursts into tears, he actually feels a lot of, well, he doesn't know he's feeling it, it's triggered. The fear and sadness is hit, he's going to act even more angry, thumps her. The more anger and violence he expresses, the more angry she feels, but she zips straight into even greater levels of fear and sadness and becomes increasingly more distressed, the more upset, the more fear and sadness she acts, the more fear and sadness he feels, the more anger he acts. The more anger she feels, the more frightened and sad she acts. So this is hooked in, locked in, and continues to escalate over the years into increasing levels of violence and aggression acted on the part of males, increasing levels of passive and depressed behaviour on the part of women. Sex role stereotyped in. We've learnt it before the age of 2. Neither men nor women are happy with this situation. Nobody is getting their needs met. Nobody is able to communicate their emotions as they feel them at the appropriate time. What is needed is for both men and women to be given permission to express the full range of human emotions with assertive behaviour rather than passive or aggressive behaviour, and to be able to communicate anger when you're angry, non-abusively so that nobody is hurt, but clearly and assertively, to express fear when you're frightened, to express sad when you're sad and happy when you're happy. In this scenario, which is a common general interaction between men and women, in this scenario, nobody is happy or getting their needs met. Now, it is true, I have generalised here, this is the general principle. But it is true that this can be swung around. Girls can be brought up with this message that you're a sook and a wuss, humiliated or at risk in some way for expressing fear or sadness. Girls can be brought up in homes where they are humiliated, punished, at risk in some way for expressing fear and sadness, and they learn to act tough when they're feeling actually frightened and sad. Boys can be brought up with this scenario, where in families it is dangerous for a boy to express any anger, or there is some other reason why he is given the message, don't you get angry around me, young man, or I'll knock your block off. Danger or some other form of message not to express his anger. Boys can also learn, when they actually feel real anger, to never never expose that behaviour, that emotion, and to act frightened or sad instead. Now, the problem there is that for those people that get that message that's swung around, they also have to do this one, the normal sex role stereotype behaviour, outside the family. So at school, they've got to be going back to this one, or at work, or at the pub, or in social settings. People have to swing back and do the normal sex role stereotype behaviour. So that means every one of these emotions gets contaminated, repressed in some way, unexpressed. Now, we have been given emotions by nature to communicate needs. And I believe that humans are probably one of the few animals on Earth who signal the wrong thing. If you are angry, for instance, and you're signalling depression, you can't get your needs met. Similarly, if you are signalling anger here, but you're actually feeling frightened or sad, you can't get your needs met. And if you think of the average dog, if they're happy, they show it from the tail to the nose. It's very clear. If they're frightened, they show it. If they're angry, they show it. If they're depressed, they show it. Animals generally don't contaminate and signal the wrong message. Emotions are there to signal very clearly in order to get your needs met for, fight, flight, whatever it might be, help. And we are, in our culture, particularly good at hiding what we really feel. In families where it is not okay to express anger when you feel angry, fear when you feel fear, sad when you feel sad, it is very often the case that it's not okay to express happy when you're happy either. that a child can come tripping in from school and say, look, Mum or Dad, look what I got, you know, for my test. And they're really happy about it. And somebody in an abusive family will say, oh God, you know, you only get 9 out of 10, why didn't you get 10 out of 10? So the carpet is pulled from under them, their self-esteem's flattened, they collapse emotionally. So children in those families, and many of us have been brought up with this, don't expose themselves to risk by coming in and showing when they're really happy. When they're really happy and proud of themselves, they may come in and act quite withdrawn. Or they might even be, you know, acting tough and aggro. So happy may have to be contaminated and hidden. Sad, when you're feeling genuinely sad, you might be smiling. Or you might be acting angry. Similarly with fear, you might have to smile when you're really frightened. A lot of people from abusive backgrounds learn to do that. A lot of us from non-abusive backgrounds learn to do that. And if you're really angry, you might have to smile, even though you're really angry. Or act one of the others. But what this means is that we put ourselves greatly at risk as human beings if we do not signal to each other what we're actually feeling. And we have had so many years of growing up without the safety to clearly communicate what we're thinking. With the average man in our culture, he doesn't actually know how to describe feelings. Many of the men that I work with will not be able to say, they come into a men's group and say, I want to know what a feeling is. I want to know what it feels like to have an emotion other than anger. We are emotionally illiterate in our culture. We don't know how to write them, we don't know how to read them, we don't know how to speak them. We generally don't know how to communicate precisely what we are feeling at the time we're feeling it, and therefore we cannot get our needs met.
You've talked about how we often substitute or contaminate one emotion for another. Is anger then always at the base of depression?
It is the case that in my experience, there are certain layers of emotions to be worked through. If you have been injured, for instance, emotionally, and the more serious the injury is, the more work needs to be done on it. But the core of the human being is happy, the core. Around that, many of us put a layer of sadness. There is a layer of real sadness that you can't get to the happy until you've worked through that sadness. Around that is a layer of anger, genuine anger, which you can't get to the sadness to get to the happy until you've dealt with that layer. And that's real anger. Around that, there is a layer of real fear. Now, they're the 4 emotions. There's a hierarchy of emotions. If you are terrified of something or very frightened of something, you cannot get angry. You can't get to the real anger. If there is anger there, you can't get to the real sadness. If there is sadness there, you can't get to the real happy part. However, because fear is such a threatening, it's the most probably threatening emotion, the most dangerous. This is where we get our sense of danger. Right? So if you're feeling fear, it's about danger. That is a very acutely threatening emotion to feel. And so what people do is put a layer of acted anger in over the top of that fear. And that's what this anger is when we're dealing with most violent men. So there's going to be an acted level of anger there. It can also be with women, that they will put in an acted level of anger, tough, acting tough. Underneath that is real fear, and then you will get to the real anger. So there is also real sadness. So if people are acting depressed, this is a substitute emotion for the real anger, but working through this you need to deal with all of the, identify what the real emotions are and work through them. You can't sort of skip these and say, okay, well look, you know, we know all about that, let's just go straight in here and be happy. You know, it generally doesn't work. But if it depends on the nature of the emotional injury and the extent of it, the intensity of it, how long it's been there, as to how quickly you can go through these layers. If there is no fear, for instance, if some people can start, for instance, just at anger here and move in. Anger, sadness, happy. For instance, if you have not been generally terrorised as a child, and let's say your partner dies, there may be anger, which is a healthy state of grieving, and sadness, and they will be the only two that have to be dealt with. There will be no fear to be dealt with. Fear will make it slower process.
If we've been trained to substitute emotions all the time, how do we know what we're really feeling?
I believe that we need to have information. That's why a lot of the work I do is education. Like with all the clients I work with, I will go through information. Because until you've got some actual facts before you and information about how people operate and why and where do I fit into that, you can't change it. So one of the things I would be doing with somebody who wasn't sure where they were in this would be going through a therapeutic process that started with information and then examining closely, very closely, specific incidents to identify which of those emotions they were feeling at the time.
What about education then? Should we be speaking to school children about this?
Exactly. In fact, it's my belief that we need a Year 10 high school intervention program to really hit it, because they're not only becoming their own people very rapidly, but they are going to be parents in 5 years' time. So we would hit 2 generations of this in one go. If we had an effective late secondary school education program about self-esteem, communication skills, sex roles, effective parenting, effective communication, we would be able to stop a lot of this rolling into one generation after another, which it does at present, and that's what we'll be talking about in part 3.